In today's video, there'll be a quick overview of how to make a plaster mold. The second part is an in-depth description of how to make another plaster mold. And the third part is lamination of paper into one of those plaster molds and assembly of the head that comes out. Let's start with a very quick overview of my plaster mold making technique. Here, I'm making a plaster piece mold of this plasticine original head of the drummer for the rock band sculpture. Hello sculptors and makers, I'm Diane van der Zanden at Atelier Arenas on Rancho Flor del Cerro in Colima, Mexico. And today I'm going to go back in time and show you how I developed my inexpensive, non-toxic, lightweight paper mache method using plaster molds. Throughout these videos, I'll show you my failures and what I've learned from them. The most crucial parts of making molds are the mold releases and the draft, or avoiding undercuts. The mold has to release from the sculpture without breaking the mold or the sculpture. If the plaster mold wraps around the sculpture in any area, the mold or the sculpture has to break in order for the pieces to come apart. I've had this happen. It's not the end of the world, so don't be too shy in starting the process. These drawings are from the book Sculpture by Arthur Williams. This original plasticine head is held onto the board with threaded rod, washers, and nuts. Before making the mold, I decide where the mold divisions will be. We want the fewest number of mold pieces possible, but we also need the pieces of the mold to release. This mold will be about 5 plaster pieces. The plasticine mold walls separate the pieces of the plaster mold. The circles are registration marks. I set up the first mold wall while checking that there are no undercuts. Once the first mold walls are smooth with registration marks, I use a mold release. In this case, it's Vaseline and mineral oil. I make sure that all of my tools and supplies are nearby, then I mix the plaster. I build up about 1 inch or 1.5 inches of plaster. The plaster changes from a creamy consistency to frosting to stone in about 30 to 45 minutes. The plaster is mixed using the Michelangelo method and is painted on with a brush, making sure to get it into all the areas of the piece without bubbles. Plaster goes through stages after it's mixed. A couple of minutes after mixing, the consistency is like frosting, and later like stone. The first mold wall is removed and a second is made, and more plaster is mixed to create the second piece, and so on until all the pieces of the mold are made. This bubble is what I try to avoid, but plaster is forgiving and it can be patched. I mix a small amount of plaster, open up the bubble, pour in the plaster, smooth it, and let it dry. Don't take the mold apart or remove the original before all of the pieces are finished. When completely cured, after at least 1 hour, the plaster pieces are taken apart and the original plasticine is removed and recycled. Meanwhile, this was the view from our front door. Back then, we could see the ocean. Back when I was impatient and thought the trees would never grow and we'd never have shade. Back when we harvested our first coffee beans and built the Greywater collection. We were learning about local flora and fauna and which flowers and vegetables can grow here. Meanwhile, I explored paper sculpture, and my studio was the entire unfinished house. I'm so excited about how this is coming together. The molds can be used over and over again to create similar yet different sculptures. They can also be used to make hollow waxes for lost wax bronze casting. If you've watched my videos in the past, you know that I got this idea from a Portuguese man who made authentic Venetian masks using plaster molds to make one-sided face masks. And it occurred to me that if I added flanges to each paper piece, I could glue and clamp them and work hollow and three-dimensionally. Had these 3 molds handy that I was going to use for clay. The surfaces are textured, and I learned that it was hard to layer the paper in without producing air bubbles. But I put 4 layers of craft paper, paper mache, into the 3 head molds, and it worked! Before I clamped them together, I realized that I had lost the mouth mold and discovered that I could stuff the mouth with plasticine, sculpt it, and laminate the paper right on top of it. I loved it. I can make it all myself. No school, no studio, no foundry needed. It's not ideal, but I worked in my living room for a long time. I can create beautiful finishes. I can use the molds over and over to create similar but different pieces. And if the paper pieces are successful, I can use the molds later to cast wax for bronze. The best thing that you can do for me is make a comment. Tell me what you're working on, how you're doing, any questions. Or subscribe and like my videos. Those are great things that help a lot, and I really appreciate it. These are the molds with the hand and feet parts layered in, and then the hands glued together. Then the puzzle parts go together. I don't have photos of it, but I used threaded rod in each leg as an armature and bolted it down to this board. My next video will show you more about how I use threaded rod to make the internal structure. At the time, I used Bondo, but quickly stopped that. Bondo's toxic, and paper paste is strong enough to hold these together. Almost every sculpture that comes out of a mold needs work. Here you can see the white paper paste that I used to work the finish. Nearly 10 years later, I still have this sculpture, and it looks just like new. I didn't finish the whole rock band sculpture, and the explorations took a long time, but I got what I needed, and I wouldn't be doing the work that I'm doing without. That's all I have for today, and just remember, you can do it too.